In 1847, the United States was a nation deeply divided by law, economy, and moral belief, and slavery stood at the center of this division, shaping daily life in the southern states in ways that were both visible and brutally normalized. At this time, enslaved people were legally classified as property rather than human beings, which meant they could be bought, sold, inherited, punished, or reassigned at the will of their owners, with no recognition of personal rights, family bonds, or individual identity. Plantations functioned not only as agricultural centers, but also as rigid systems of control where every aspect of an enslaved person's life was monitored and exploited for labor and profit. When a plantation owner died, particularly a male head of household, his wife often inherited both land and enslaved people, placing widows in positions of unexpected authority. These women, though constrained by the patriarchal norms of the era, still exercised immense power over enslaved individuals, making decisions that could permanently alter lives. In a society where women had limited public rights, owning slaves paradoxically granted widows economic and social leverage, allowing them to preserve wealth, negotiate marriages for their children, and maintain their position within the local elite. The year 1847 also existed within a broader atmosphere of fear and instability. As abolitionist movements were gaining momentum in the North, slave revolts haunted the imagination of Southern landowners, and political tensions hinted at a coming national conflict. Slaveholders increasingly obsessed over control, longevity, and inheritance, fearing that any weakness, whether economic, physical, or familial, could result in decline. Within this mindset, enslaved people were not only laborers, but also assets whose physical traits were evaluated in cold, transactional terms, including strength, endurance, and reproductive potential. Pseudoscientific ideas about race were widely accepted among white elites, who falsely believed that selective reproduction could produce stronger workers or serve specific family goals. These beliefs were reinforced by ministers, doctors, and local leaders, giving moral cover to actions that were deeply inhumane. Enslaved families were routinely separated, marriages had no legal standing, and children born into slavery automatically inherited enslaved status, further entrenching the system across generations. For widows managing estates, decisions were often framed as practical necessities rather than ethical choices, shaped by economic survival and social pressure rather than compassion. The absence of legal accountability allowed cruelty to be disguised as management, and personal desires were often justified as tradition or duty. At the same time, white daughters in such households were raised within this structure, taught from an early age that slavery was natural, necessary, and divinely sanctioned, even as they themselves were restricted by expectations of obedience, marriage, and motherhood. The plantation thus became a space where power flowed unevenly, with enslaved people at the bottom, stripped of agency, and white women occupying a complicated middle ground, subordinate in gender but dominant in race and class. Understanding this historical moment requires recognizing how normalized violence and control had become, how law and custom worked together to erase empathy, and how everyday decisions were shaped by a system that rewarded dehumanization. The year 1847 was not an exception but a reflection of a broader reality, one in which human lives were reduced to calculations of value, lineage, and survival, laying the groundwork for stories that continue to shock modern readers precisely because they reveal how ordinary such injustices once were. The widow's motivation was shaped by a mixture of fear, social pressure, and deeply ingrained beliefs that were common among slaveholding families in the mid-19th century, where survival was often understood not in emotional or moral terms, but in economic and biological ones. After the death of her husband, she found herself solely responsible for maintaining the plantation, protecting her family's social standing and ensuring that her daughters would have a future in a society that judged women almost entirely by marriage prospects, inheritance, and perceived strength of lineage. Without a male heir, the widow likely felt exposed and vulnerable, aware that land, wealth, and influence could easily slip away if her family appeared weak or unstable. In this environment, anxiety about decline was constant, and many slaveholders believed that physical traits such as height, strength, and endurance were indicators of superiority, ideas reinforced by the racial pseudoscience of the era. These false theories claimed that human characteristics could be engineered through controlled reproduction, and slave owners often applied this logic to enslaved people without hesitation, seeing it as rational management rather than moral violation. The widow's decision to focus on the tallest enslaved man reflected this distorted worldview, where the human body was reduced to a tool for solving personal and familial insecurities. She may have convinced herself that her actions were necessary, even protective, framing them as a way to secure her daughter's future, rather than acknowledging the violence inherent in removing consent and humanity from another person. Society around her offered little resistance to such thinking. Neighbors, local leaders, and even religious authorities frequently supported the idea that slaveholders had the right to make absolute decisions over enslaved lives. Within this framework, the widow's role as a mother further complicated her reasoning, as maternal instinct became entangled with control, leading her to prioritize perceived strength and continuity over ethics. Her daughters were viewed not as individuals with autonomy, but as extensions of the family legacy, whose bodies and futures were also subject to planning and manipulation. The widow likely believed that by controlling outcomes, she was acting wisely in an unpredictable world, where illness, poverty, or social disgrace could destroy generations of work. At the same time, emotional detachment was a learned survival mechanism among slaveholders, allowing them to distance themselves from the suffering they caused by focusing on abstract goals like stability and lineage. This detachment was reinforced by language that avoided acknowledging violence, replacing it with terms such as duty, necessity, or tradition. The widow's power was both real and fragile, built on a system that gave her authority over enslaved people while still limiting her freedom as a woman, and this contradiction often intensified the need to exert control wherever possible. Her decision was not an isolated act of cruelty, but part of a broader culture that rewarded dominance and punished empathy, where questioning the morality of slavery threatened one's identity and security. By choosing to manipulate lives rather than challenge the system, the widow aligned herself with the values of her class, ensuring acceptance and protection at the cost of human suffering. This motivation reveals how slavery corrupted personal judgment, turning fear into justification and responsibility into oppression, and demonstrates how ordinary people became active participants in extraordinary injustice, not through hatred alone, but through self-interest, social conditioning, and the desire to feel in control of an uncertain future. The enslaved man's reality was defined by powerlessness, uncertainty, and a constant awareness that his life was governed by forces beyond his control, a condition that shaped every thought, movement, and emotion he experienced. From the moment he was enslaved, his identity was stripped away and replaced with a value assigned by others, measured in physical ability, obedience, and productivity rather than character or humanity. His height, which in another world might have been a simple personal trait, became a defining feature used to judge his worth, turning his body into an object of interest rather than a vessel of lived experience. Enslaved men were routinely evaluated like livestock, discussed in terms of strength, durability, and usefulness, and this constant scrutiny created a life lived under observation, where even silence could be interpreted as defiance. He would have known that resistance, whether spoken or silent, carried severe consequences, including violence, separation from loved ones, or death, and this knowledge forced many enslaved people into a state of controlled endurance rather than open rebellion. His daily existence was shaped by exhausting labor, limited rest, and the psychological burden of knowing that nothing he produced, not even his own children, truly belonged to him. Enslaved families were fragile and temporary, held together by hope rather than law, and the fear of being sold away from parents, partners, or children was a constant shadow over every connection. When decisions were made about his future, they were done without consultation or explanation, reinforcing the reality that his thoughts, desires, and consent were irrelevant within the system that bound him. The absence of choice extended beyond labor into the most personal aspects of life, erasing the boundary between public control and private existence. Emotional survival often required a careful balance between detachment and quiet resistance, finding meaning in small acts of humanity such as storytelling, faith, or shared moments of solidarity with others who endured the same conditions. Yet even these internal refuges were threatened by the unpredictability of slaveholders' decisions, which could abruptly alter the course of a life with no warning. Being selected for a role based on physical traits did not come with recognition or respect, only increased vulnerability, as attention from owners often meant further exploitation rather than relief. The enslaved man would have understood that his body was seen as a resource to be used until depleted, and this awareness could foster a deep sense of isolation, knowing that his suffering was invisible to those in power. At the same time, he carried memories, relationships, and a sense of self that the system could not fully erase, even as it attempted to reduce him to function alone. His endurance was not consent, and his silence was not agreement, but rather the result of a system designed to punish any assertion of autonomy. The emotional toll of such a life was immense, as hope had to be carefully guarded to avoid despair, and trust was risky in a world where betrayal was often enforced by survival. Understanding his reality requires recognizing that enslaved people were not passive figures in history, but individuals navigating an environment of constant threat with resilience and inner strength, even when stripped of outward freedom. His experience reflects the broader truth of slavery, that it was not only a system of forced labor, but a deliberate destruction of personal agency, dignity, and choice, carried out daily through laws, customs, and unchecked authority. The enslaved man's life, shaped by fear and endurance, stands as a reminder that behind every historical decision made by slaveholders was a human being forced to live with its consequences, carrying pain that history often records only in fragments, but which defined an entire existence. The lives of the 5 daughters were shaped from birth by a rigid social system that defined their value, behavior, and future long before they were capable of making choices for themselves, embedding expectations so deeply that they often appeared natural rather than imposed. Raised on a plantation, they grew up surrounded by enslaved people whose labor sustained their comfort, and this environment taught them early lessons about hierarchy, obedience, and entitlement. Slavery was presented to them not as cruelty but as order, a normal and necessary structure that supported family stability and social respect. Education for daughters in such households focused less on intellectual independence and more on refinement, manners, and preparation for marriage, reinforcing the idea that their primary purpose was to continue the family line and protect its status. They were taught to see themselves as fragile yet valuable, requiring protection while simultaneously being responsible for upholding family honor. This contradiction limited their autonomy, as their bodies and futures were closely monitored, discussed, and planned by others, particularly their mother, whose authority over them was both maternal and strategic. The daughters' understanding of morality was shaped by the adults around them, who framed control as care and dominance as responsibility, making it difficult to distinguish compassion from cruelty. While they benefited from racial privilege, they were also confined by gender roles. That denied them independence, leaving them dependent on decisions made by parents and, later, husbands. Emotional expression was often discouraged, especially when it conflicted with family interests, teaching the daughters to suppress discomfort or doubt in favor of obedience. Their interactions with enslaved people were filtered through lessons of superiority, discouraging empathy by reinforcing distance and difference. Over time, this conditioning could dull moral awareness, allowing harmful practices to be accepted without question. At the same time, the daughters lived under constant scrutiny, aware that their behavior reflected not only on themselves, but on the family as a whole, increasing pressure to conform. Marriage prospects, physical health, and reputation were matters of constant concern, and any deviation from expectations could threaten security. The daughters were also witnesses to the power their mother exercised, learning that authority could be maintained through control rather than understanding. This lesson shaped how they viewed relationships, often associating love with obedience and care with dominance. Yet beneath this conditioning, moments of confusion or unease may have surfaced, as the reality of suffering around them occasionally conflicted with the narratives they were taught. Such moments, however, were rarely encouraged or explored, as questioning the system meant questioning family, faith, and identity. The daughters' lives thus unfolded within carefully drawn boundaries, where choice was limited and futures were negotiated rather than chosen. Their privilege insulated them from physical hardship, but not from emotional constraint, as their roles were predetermined and their individuality secondary to lineage. In this way, the system shaped them into participants rather than decision-makers, beneficiaries rather than architects, bound to a legacy they did not create yet were expected to uphold. Understanding their impact requires acknowledging both their advantage and their confinement, recognizing that while they were not victims in the same sense as the enslaved, they were nevertheless molded by a system that reduced human relationships to functions of power, inheritance, and survival. The legacy of this story extends far beyond the individuals directly involved, reaching into the broader history of slavery and leaving traces that continue to influence how the past is understood and remembered today. Actions taken under slavery were often justified at the time as practical, lawful, or necessary, yet with distance and reflection they reveal a system built on profound moral failure and sustained by the normalization of cruelty. The idea of creating or preserving a bloodline through forced control exposes how deeply slavery distorted human values, reducing life, family, and identity to tools for maintaining power and status. Such practices did not end with the individuals who carried them out, but echoed across generations, shaping family histories, racial hierarchies, and social inequalities that persisted long after slavery's formal abolition. The descendants of enslaved people often inherited trauma rather than property, carrying forward memories of loss, separation, and denied humanity, while the descendants of slaveholders inherited wealth, land, or social advantage rooted in exploitation. This imbalance became embedded in institutions, laws, and cultural attitudes, making slavery not just a historical event, but a foundation for ongoing injustice. Moral reflection on stories like this forces modern readers to confront uncomfortable truths about how ordinary people participated in extraordinary harm, often without seeing themselves as cruel. It reveals how systems of oppression rely not only on violence but also on silence, compliance, and the willingness to prioritize self-interest over empathy. Remembering these histories is not about assigning individual guilt to the present, but about understanding responsibility, recognizing how past choices shape current realities, and acknowledging the human cost hidden behind economic or social success. Such reflection challenges simplified narratives that portray history as inevitable or neutral, instead emphasizing that slavery was a series of decisions made by people who had alternatives, even if those alternatives required sacrifice. The process of reckoning also highlights the importance of restoring humanity to those who were erased from official records, whose lives were documented only through property lists, sales, or statistics. By telling their stories with care and honesty, history shifts from abstract numbers to lived experience, allowing empathy to replace distance. This legacy also raises questions about memory and accountability, asking whose stories are preserved, whose are ignored, and why. Societies that fail to confront their past risk repeating patterns of dehumanization under new names and forms. Moral reflection therefore becomes an active responsibility rather than a passive exercise, encouraging critical examination of power, privilege, and inequality in the present. The story serves as a reminder that injustice is rarely sudden or isolated. It grows through acceptance, justification, and routine. Understanding this legacy does not undo the harm that was done, but it can inform more ethical choices going forward by making visible the consequences of treating human lives as means rather than ends. In this way, the enduring impact of slavery lies not only in historical suffering, but in the ongoing challenge it presents to recognize shared humanity, to question systems that benefit some at the expense of others, and to ensure that the lessons of the past guide the pursuit of dignity, justice, and accountability in the future.